Hello and welcome to today's webinar on mapping PFAS, co-sponsored with TCR companies. My name is Chandler Randall and I am the Manager of Educational Programs here at the Environmental Law Institute, and I am so delighted to welcome everyone to this webinar. ELI is proud to offer programming on cutting-edge issues in environmental law and policy, and it is such an honor to have you join us today for this special program. Throughout today's webinar, we will be taking your questions, so please submit your questions through GoTo's question box, and please do not wait until the end. Send us your questions as soon as you think of them. I would like to thank our outstanding panelists for joining us today to lend their expertise to this webinar, and while they will be introduced briefly, the full speaker bios are posted on our website, eli.org, and I strongly encourage you to check out their expertise and experience in more detail there. As we begin, I would like to very briefly introduce today's moderator, Beth Myers-Graham. Beth serves as the Chief Growth Officer for Environmental at TRC Companies. Previously, Beth led AECOM's environmental health and safety practice, which focused on global M&A, compliance and permitting support, EHS auditing, due diligence, and process safety management and engineering services. Beth holds a bachelor's degree in environmental science and political science from Bowling Green State University and a master's degree in environmental science from Michigan State University. Thank you all so much. And with that, I will turn things over to our amazing moderator, Beth Myers-Graham. Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you, Chandler. Thank you. And thank you, everyone, for joining today's panel on mapping PFAS, tracing legal and policy issues and trends. As Chandler mentioned, I am Beth Myers-Graham from TRC. And I am very happy and proud to co-host today's discussion with ELI, a great organization that I've been happy to be involved with for several years now. I am joined by 4 panelists who will each be bringing a unique perspective to how various stakeholders are addressing PFAS-related concerns. Please let me introduce Elizabeth Denley, Vice President and PFAS Initiative Leader at TRC, Anita Desikan, a Senior Analyst with the Union of Concerned Scientists, Liz Hitchcock, Director for Safer Chemicals, Healthy Families, and Joseph Konchelik, an attorney with Tucker Ellis. So with that, I would like to now turn the discussion over to Liz Denley. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Beth. Okay, so today I'm going to spend most of my time on technical aspects of PFAS forensics and some tools available to help you with source identification. So I have no way near enough time to share everything I'd like, but I'm going to give you a snapshot of a couple of tools or concepts that you need to think about in your forensics evaluations. So I always like to start, hold on, let's see. There we go, with this slide. In any PFAS presentation I'm giving. So it seems to apply all the time. So we know PFAS are complicated. There's challenges with how PFAS cycles through the environment, the basis of toxicology, the regulations are all over the place. We still don't have a final multi-lab validated standard EPA method for non-drinking water matrices. We have limited options for treatment, and the public perception is really driving a lot of the action that we are seeing. But one of the major challenges of PFAS is that it's costing a lot of money to investigate and clean up. And who, is ultimately going to pay for this? Is it going to be the municipalities, the manufacturers of PFAS, the users of PFAS? And I'm not going to discuss that specifically today, but in this determination of who will pay, forensics may come into play. And that will be the focus of my talk today. So understanding the potential sources of PFAS out there is important for our forensics evaluations and site characterizations. There's many different industries or products where PFAS are used. And this information is going to be useful when you're considering what types of sites might have PFAS contamination or from where the contamination might originate. And it will be an important part of your forensics analysis. So forensics is, not just about the chemistry, but also about looking into the operational history, potential nearby sites or sources that may be affecting your site. There's some great papers out there also on PFAS sources that I could provide you access to as well if you're interested. So PFAS are, just about everywhere. So we really need to use some of this specific source information when we're differentiating PFAS at our sites. And this table is really just a brief summary and an example of something that you could use to start your analysis. Okay, so let's begin discussing some of the technical concepts in PFAS forensics. So to start, TRC is developed, and we've effectively used a PFAS forensics tool for source identification and differentiation. So our tool right now can accommodate 37 different PFAS chemicals you can see on the bottom left here. The larger pie chart on the screen today contains select PFAS analytes. So in my presentation today, we're going to use these compounds as the focus of discussion. So about half this pie chart you can see on the left side covers what we call perfluorocarboxylic acids in the blue shade, so compounds like PFOA or PFNA. And about half the pie chart on the right side covers the perfluorosulfonic acids in the yellow, oranges, and red, so compounds like PFOS, PFBS. Also included here a couple of precursors, telomeres, 5,3-fluorotelomere carboxylic acid, and 6,2-fluorotelomere sulfonate in this darker colors here. And these are examples of the many different precursor compounds that can break down and be transformed into these perfluorocarboxylic acids or perfluorosulfonic acids. So throughout most of my slides, the color code will remain the same for these constituents. Okay, so this slide gives you a very big picture summary of some of the different signatures we may see, which can reflect different sources. I know it's hard to see, but if you look at the top of the slide, you can see a lot of the red and orange perfluorosulfonic acids. So this is PFOS, perfluorohexane sulfonic acid, and this is most likely an aqueous film-forming foam, AFFF, the firefighting foam that we're going to talk about in a little bit. And towards the bottom, you see possibly maybe a plastic source because you see more of the blue perfluorocarboxylic acids, and specifically PFOA. So these types of chemical signatures can be used to identify various characteristics, and not just of sources, but also characteristics of fate and transport scenarios. So we may see the breakdown of certain PFAS precursor compounds like the fluorotelomeres further downstream in a plume, and we can show a plume becoming more enriched in something else because of the breakdown of those precursors. And I will talk a little bit more about that in a minute. There also can be, a change in signatures due to commingling of more than one source along a plume. So it's critical to really understand all potential sources along a PFAS plume. So the chemical signatures are an excellent starting point in providing information on different sources and different fate and transport scenarios. But they're just a starting point because with PFAS, there is a lot going on. Okay, so I'm not going to really spend any time on this slide today, but we're beginning to understand more and more when there are certain PFAS chemicals that are more indicative of a particular source, particular product, particular industry, and some of that is highlighted here as examples. So I'm sure you'll be getting copies of these presentations, so you'll have this as a reference. Okay, so I want to spend a little bit of time today on AFFF, which is the aqueous film-forming foam, the firefighting foam, and show you some examples of the signatures that can be helpful, because I think as most of us know, AFFF is one of the major sources of PFAS contamination. And more often than not, then you are going to be dealing with AFFF at your PFAS sites. So let me kind of just start with a general overview. In general, there are three different categories of AFFF. So first, we have the legacy first generation AFFF. So most of these were PFOS-based foams, were sold under the brand name 3M Lightwater. And although sales of this kind of foam ended in 2002, many locations still contain this foam in their inventory. So these foams typically contain PFOS, perfluorohexane sulfonic acid, and maybe even PFOA. Second is the legacy second generation AFFF. So these were sold from 1970s till 2016. These foams are fluorotelomere based, but they contain the long chain fluorotelomere, most likely 8,2-fluorotelomere sulfonate mixed with the 6,2-fluorotelomere sulfonate. But it's that longer chain 8,2-fluorotelomere sulfonate that we're concerned about because that particular compound can break down and form PFOA. And finally, there's the modern fluorotelomere AFFF. So most foam manufacturers have now transitioned to the use of only short chain fluorotelomers, so the 6,2-fluorotelomere sulfonate mostly. These foams do not contain or break down in the environment to PFOS or PFOA. They may contain trace amounts of PFOA as a byproduct of the manufacturing process, but PFOA is not an ingredient of these foams. So due to the production methods and the variability in AFFF formulations through the years, AFFF can contain complex mixtures of PFAS. But understanding, just some of the basics can help us start to differentiate these different types of AFFF, and it will be important for your forensics analysis. So here is a simplistic look at the different AFFF signatures. So the first one on the left is the first generation legacy PFOS-based AFFF. And you can see it also contains a good percentage of the perfluorohexane sulfonic acid. And it's actually important to note that different lots of AFFF produced by 3M had different ratios of PFOS to perfluorohexane sulfonic acid. The second one here is a second generation AFFF. So this one, again, has equal amounts of the 6,2 and 8,2 fluorotelomere sulfonate. There's also a little PFOA here, which is likely a breakdown product of the 8,2 fluorotelomere sulfonate. And the last one here is the modern fluorotelomere AFFF, the one that most foam manufacturers have switched over to, with the major component being that 6,2 fluorotelomere sulfonate. So again, it's just a very simple view of the different AFFF signatures. Okay, so now we're going to add a different dimension to the forensics interpretation. So generating pie charts, based on a regular PFAS analysis of individual PFAS compounds is step one. Okay, but then we need to look at how some of the very unique PFAS fate and transport properties can also play a role in the forensics interpretation. So I'm going to spend some time today talking about two unique concepts. There are more, but I only have time to really talk about two today, and I picked these two because I think they're pretty important. So the first one we're going to look at is PFAS transformation. So there are thousands of precursor PFAS compounds that we will not or do not measure in a standard PFAS analysis. But these precursor PFAS compounds can transform or break down in the environment into the more persistent PFAS chemicals that we do analyze for, like PFOA and PFOS and others. So the signatures of surface water or groundwater from a release containing precursor PFAS, there's some examples here, like the 6,2 or 8,2 fluorotelomere sulfonate. Those signatures may instead show a higher prevalence of the 6,2 or 8,2 fluorotelomere sulfonate transformation products, as shown here in this rules of thumb. So the precursor PFAS, like the 8,2 or 6,2 FDS that we just discussed in the AFFF, will degrade or break down into the more soluble and more mobile compounds, and again into the more persistent compounds like PFOA or perfluorobutanoic acid. So detections, if we detect PFOA associated with an AFFF release, it's most likely from the use of the longer chain fluorotelomere-based foam, the 8,2 FTS. So one tool that we have is what's called a top assay analysis. So top stands for total oxidizable precursor. So the top assay will take the sample, the original sample, will do a very strong oxidation of it and break down any of those precursor compounds. So the top assay will not break down the persistent compounds like PFOA and PFOS. It will only break down those precursors. So in essence, the top assay is actually accelerating the natural rate of transformation and can be a more realistic estimate of potential environmental liability than the typical PFAS analysis, especially if you have a fluorotelomere-based AFFF released or a residual source. So you can see the pie chart here with the result. This is the results of the sample before the top assay was done. So if you look here after the top assay was done on the sample, if you look at the bottom part of the slide, you can see that the 6,2 fluorotelomere sulfonate, which again is a precursor PFAS compound, was oxidized because it reduced in concentration. It went from 40,000 nanograms per liter to 1,000 nanograms per liter. While many of these perfluorocarboxylic acids, the light blue here on the pie charts, increased dramatically in concentration. So you see dramatic increases for the C4, C5, C6, C7 perfluorocarboxylic acids here. The same compounds that are shown here as transformation products in the rules of thumb box for a 6,2 fluorotelomere sulfonate. So we can use the top assay to help us determine that ultimate source of AFFF because of these PFAS transformation properties, especially when we think we have more than one source of AFFF at a site. So it's very important to think about PFAS transformation during your forensics analysis. Okay, so some specific examples of how the top assay can help us understand PFAS transformations of AFFF in a forensics investigation. I'm not going to read this to you here, but there are a few tips here that you can use in conjunction with other information. You want to look at the rules of thumb first, of course, for the transformation of the 6,2 and 8,2 fluorotelmer sulfonate AFFF. You want to look at the ratios of some of the breakdown compounds and also you want to look at which breakdown products are there and which ones are not there. And you can start to figure out the AFFF source. So again, I'm not going to read these. They're here for you. They can be helpful when looking at scenarios where the potential for more than one AFFF source exists, something that we've found pretty helpful, especially at some airport sites. Okay, so another unique PFAS fate and transport concept that I want to discuss today that can play a role in forensics is sorption to solids. So here, the issue is chemical sorption of specific PFAS to organic materials or solids. So it's important to understand for forensics because the sorption property can have a significant effect on the chemical signatures produced and also can...
Temporarily, I forward my link to your...
I think you have to go on mute, sorry. Sorry. So the sorption property can have a significant effect on the chemical signatures produced. It can also significantly affect the concentrations of PFAS in a sample. So what we see are the longer chain PFAS, so the C8 and higher, and especially the perfluorosulfonic acids like PFOS, can have higher absorption to solids. So again, how is it going to affect forensics? So let's just look at the pie charts here. So this is an example of groundwater, which was sampled from a temporary well compared to the same groundwater sampled from a 2-inch well that was properly developed. So you see at the top, the turbid water has a much different composition than the clearer water with higher concentrations of that 6-carbon perfluorosulfonic acid and the 8-carbon PFOA. And again, we know the longer chain PFAS, and even more so for those perfluorosulfonic acids, will adhere more to the solids. So depending on how the water was sampled, how much particulates were present in the sample can affect your forensics interpretation and then ultimately your determination of liability. So sometimes, we submit samples, wastewater samples, surface water samples, even groundwater samples to labs, and these samples may be turbid or they may contain elevated levels of particulates. So when our samples are turbid or they have elevated levels of particulates, again, it could affect the forensics interpretation. And it also may be dependent on what the lab did with that sample and how they handled those particulates. So the point here is that something many people are not aware of is that there's a major inconsistency in the lab community on handling of aqueous samples with particulates in PFAS analysis. So there's no consistent method out there right now. And again, the particulates can significantly affect the concentrations, and not only the concentrations, but you can see in the pie charts here, it can affect the signatures that we create. So the resulting concentrations of PFAS and the resulting fingerprint of PFAS is going to vary depending on how the lab handled that sample. And I just listed some of the potential differences from lab to lab for your reference, but it's really very important to, one, first, if you can, work with the lab ahead of time, figure out what you want based on the project objective, or two, which is many times the case, you receive data and that's already been generated. But you should really make sure you understand what the lab did and if particulates were an issue, because it could affect your forensics interpretation. So, question the data that you receive. Okay, so as we know, the standard PFAS analyte list that our commercial labs are doing continues to change. Obviously, the more information that we have on the composition, the better it is for source identification. So the commercial labs right now are analyzing up to about 75 different PFAS compounds. So when you're looking at signatures, it really requires careful consideration of the analyte list. So what I'm trying to show here is that the slide's going to show the same exact data set, but the evaluation looks really different based on the analytes selected. So if you look at the pie charts on the left here, the top and bottom one circled, we're only looking at PFOA and PFAS. It looks like it's only PFOA. So you might think it's a Teflon manufacturer. But if you look at the same two pie charts for the same samples, but with more analytes reported, you see something else going on here, and these signatures are very different. So make sure you understand, again, what analytes were used in the evaluation. And again, the more you use, the better. So what I'm going to end here today with a very quick case study example. It's from a regional airport we worked at. And at one airport, we were able to identify 5 different AFFF sources. So first here, there was an emergency response in 1996 in the area of the runway at the top of the figure here where foam was used. And you can see the signatures going down from the runway through the creek to the lake are all pretty comparable. This is 4 miles long, all one source, same signature, same relative concentrations. So it was an old source, it was still persistent, and it impacted lakes and recreational ponds for 4 miles. The second release was from a nozzle training area. This also eventually went to the creek and then to the lake. Third, up top here was a PFOA rich source. It was kind of an oddball. It's a different signature that we think is probably associated with 8,2-fluorotellumer sulfonate, AFFF. We're not 100% sure, but it was small and it was a low mass source. Fourth, we had a hanger release. This was from a new modern foam, the C6 foam. It was barely detectable after a couple of months and not a major constituent after 2 months. And the fifth one, if you look at the 2 pie charts on the right here, these pie charts show another potential source from a release of concentrated AFFF. And they kind of look like the pie charts from the older emergency response here on the left, but there are differences between all these releases based on the ratios of PFOS to perfluorohexane sulfonic acid. So as I mentioned earlier, different lots of AFFF produced by 3M had different ratios of PFOS to perfluorohexane sulfonic acid. So oh, also, hold on, one more thing. Yeah, at the top here, up gradient, you can see different signatures. This was from up here, was from Streamwater from a Superfund site, which is north of this slide. And the signature off to the left here, the orange blue, this was a signature of groundwater in people's private wells associated with their own development, and probably from an up gradient C&D landfill, or possibly from a septic system, but it was not similar to this emergency response signature. So using this forensics, we were able to save our client a lot of money by demonstrating which source of PFAS contamination was due to their AFFF. Okay, so in the interest of time, I'm not going to read this slide, but I think the takeaway message that I want to give is that PFAS forensics, involves not only chemical signatures, but a really good understanding of the unique fate and transport properties of PFAS. And I think from there, I'm going to turn it over to Joe Konchelik from Tucker Ellis.
All right, and I know Joe has had some technical difficulties, but I believe he is getting on now. Joe, are you able to hear us and speak? All right, I think we may need to come back to Joe at the end. So, oh, maybe he just got the ability to speak. Are you there?
Can you hear me now?
We can hear you now.
All right. Well, I guess we'll do this from my iPhone. So apologize to everybody in attendance. So I'm going to have to squint a little bit to see the slides. So if I mess up anything, please don't hold it against me. So I've been asked to talk about following Liz's great presentation here on the technical side of things, the legal considerations associated with PFAS. I'm going to go through this very quickly because you could spend an entire day seminar on each one of these topics. So you're going to get the 30,000 foot quick overview on 3 topics: current litigations, kind of status of regulation both at the state and federal level, and then transactional considerations regarding PFAS as well. So next slide. First, I'm going to talk about PFAS class action litigation. Next slide. So the first case is pretty famous. Many of you may have seen the Hollywood movie or at least seen an advertised called Dark Waters. this was really the case that set the stage for PFAS litigation, and it Leach versus DuPont, and it involved 80,000 residents that were in close proximity to their Washington Works, the DuPont Washington Works facility. And the plaintiffs alleged bodily injury from water contamination from PFOA. And this initial stage of the class action litigation sought a science panel to be impaneled to look at the link between exposure and any injury. And kind of key takeaways from this case was first, at this stage, early litigation, really the science had not been developed a ton in terms of exposure and links to disease. And the science panel, from estimates and research I did, some are estimating the total cost reached $100 million. And that's just for medical monitoring, taking raw blood samples, et cetera. Keep that number in mind as we go through and talk about some additional class action litigation in a moment. Next slide. So the second component, after that class was certified, they did the medical monitoring. An additional of those members of the original 70,000, 3,500 members made allegations of actual injury, disease based on their exposure. 3 cases went to trial. All 3 resulted in very sizable judgments for the plaintiffs. And then you see, as indicated on the slide, that class action litigation actually settled through 2 different settlements, one in 2017, one in 2021, nearly $750 million all told. And that really, as I said, set the stage for class action litigation. So next slide. Another very significant ongoing class action litigation is the litigation associated with AFFF, which is currently pending in the South Carolina federal court. Tucker Ellis does represent a client in that litigation. The litigation stems from the use of AFFF, which Liz I know talked about to some degree, which was specifically designed with PFAS compounds because it was highly effective to put out what are called Class B fires, those involving flammable liquids and diesel fuel, et cetera. So airports all over the country, military bases had AFFF, and that was routinely used both in training exercises and if you actually had an accident or spill of some kind involving fuel. AFFF was highly effective at putting out those fires quickly. In this class action litigation, there's over 1,000 cases currently consolidated, and we're at the very early stages of that litigation. There has been a large amount of discovery performed, many depositions, and over 1 million documents have been produced so far as doing discovery. The court has selected 10 bellwether cases to move forward. The initial idea is on those, they're going to try and resolve some common legal issues that may apply to those cases. But this will be a long process, and this case is likely to go on for years to come. Next slide. The other major class action, which pretty significant news came out this week, is the Hardwick litigation here in Ohio. This class action, the plaintiffs asserted that any individual nationwide, this was the original class certification they were seeking, any individual nationwide that had the levels that you see on the screen there of PFOA or PFAS in their blood could be a member of the class. And some estimates, some people say that could, because most people in the United States do have some level of PFAS in their blood. It could represent, because those levels are so low, could represent 99% of the U.S. population. The defendants called this class, the proposed class, the most ambitious class imaginable. Similar to leach, the plaintiffs are seeking another science panel. And as I mentioned before, keeping in mind the leach case by some estimates cost in the range of $100 million to do the medical monitoring and studies. So we're going to talk next about some significant rulings, but that was with a class size of 70,000. The class has, as I'm going to talk about, we can move to the next slide actually. The class has been certified in a ruling that just came out this week, initially for all Ohioans or any individual subject to the laws of the state of Ohio. So that's roughly 7 million people, I guess, in the class. And then what the court ruled is, and why they made that distinction. So the plaintiff was seeking a nationwide class. The court ruled for now that it would be limited to those individuals subject to the state of Ohio. The reason for that is because not all states recognize increased risk of disease as a compensable injury, and only certain states do. And what the court ended up ruling is saying that initially Ohio does recognize that as a claim, and therefore all Ohioans would be certified in the class. And then the court has asked for additional briefing from both plaintiff and defendant as to other states with similar laws to Ohio that do recognize that as an injury. And so briefing is going to take place now. Certainly it would seem that the class is going to grow beyond just Ohio and will be very sizable. But as I mentioned, if 70,000 people in the leach case, that panel cost 100 million, you can imagine what the cost of a science panel and the studies and the medical monitoring would cost for the Hardwick case as this case progresses. Next slide. So that's the class action litigation. Next, I'm going to talk about also state actions. So the first one up is the Minnesota versus 3M case. This is, so the most of the cases I'm going to talk about here very quickly are state actions that sought cleanup for the most part. You're either doing natural resource damage claims, impacts to surface water, groundwater, etc. Minnesota was the first that brought this case. That case settled for $850 million. Next slide. Another case that was brought was in Michigan against Wolverine, which was a shoe and boot manufacturer who used Scotchgard as part of their manufacturing process. And Michigan sought investigation of contamination associated with PFAS related to the manufacturing process. Also sought providing safe drinking water supplies to those that may have contaminated drinking water supplies. This case also settled in two separate settlements, 2019, 2020, all told in excess of $100 million in that case. So another very sizable settlement. Next slide. The last case I wanted to just touch on, and there's others that I'm skipping over because there's been multiple state actions filed and they're all in various stages, but this one was interesting to me in a different vein in that in Wisconsin, the largest business lobby sued Wisconsin DNR, who was seeking investigation and cleanup at 90 different sites across the state for PFAS contamination. And the business group basically argued that Wisconsin did not have the state legal authority to pursue those cleanups and did not also have the legal authority to require sampling in an investigation from wastewater discharges. The judge just recently ruled in January and did hold that the state had authority to require sampling, but that it could not enforce for now any kind of cleanup standards because Wisconsin had yet to adopt applicable cleanup standards. Although there's more portions of that case that are moving forward. And as I mentioned here, another major ruling is anticipated to come in April. Next slide. As I mentioned, that's just a few. You've got cases filed in Ohio, New Jersey, and elsewhere. Most of these too are very similar to ones I highlighted in that they're seeking natural resource damages or cleanup type actions. Next slide. So key takeaways, you've got two major MDLs that have one of the largest classes ever certified with the Hardwick case, and that class is, that's litigation and decision about how large the class is going to be is still ongoing. And then you also have the AFFF litigation, which has over 1,000, airports all over the country, military bases, in addition to local municipalities that have all been in that suit seeking cleanup and injury claims as well. So those are going to be ongoing for years to come, it seems, with major components of that. And that litigation, the class action litigation, really has been driving a lot of the science that's been related to the litigation, at least, through the science panels. What's interesting, and we'll talk about as I progress here, is that most of those claims in the litigation, whether they're the state claims or the class action litigation, have been based on common law tort theories such as trespass, nuisance, and negligence. What I think you're going to see as we move forward with more federal regulation is you're going to see a major sea change forthcoming, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Cleanup issues, a lot of states are seeking cleanup, and that's complicated by the fact that, some states have adopted MCLs and cleanup standards, others have not. There's no federal standard. That's making things complicated. And finally, the major focus on a lot of this litigation has been pursuing manufacturers. It's probably no major crystal ball similar to asbestos litigation that as this litigation progresses, you will see other, distributors or other users of PFAS being targeted with litigation. Next slide. So I'm going to now move to state regulation of PFAS. Next slide. Because the federal government was very slow to move forward with any definitive regulations or even drinking water standards or classifying PFAS compounds as either a hazardous waste or a hazardous substance, states really became to fill the void, the regulatory void. This slide just kind of shows how many states at least have adopted policies. Next slide. Other states have not waited for the federal government to adopt drinking water standards. I've only highlighted the ones that actually have adopted MCL standards. Many other states actually do have policies, non-enforceable policies. Things that I think are kind of interesting on this slide is the variation in standards between the various states, and also the variation in the compounds that are regulated. It certainly seems to scream for the need for a federal standard across the country. Next slide. What's happening at the federal level in terms of federal regulation of PFAS? Next slide. I'm going to go through these really quickly. In essence, US EPA has released a strategic roadmap. Their desire was to look both upstream and downstream. What does that mean? Upstream meaning they're trying to target and prevent industries that are releasing PFAS, and downstream is meant to deal with historical issues. Next slide. So all these slides are in your presentation. I'm just gonna kind of go through very high level. There's some additional information in there that you can look through later. But in essence, US EPA is going forward with a multitude of regulation. First, they want to collect more information on releases. They're using TRI and TSCA largely to try to collect information on which industries are releasing. One thing I wanted to highlight here is with the TRI initiative, they're trying to remove the de minimis exemption there from reporting requirements, meaning they're really trying to get down to very low releases and track that information. Next slide. They're also pursuing both wastewater and stormwater. This is going to be through establishing, through the Clean Water Act, regulations for discharge standards, stormwater, BMPs, and pretreatment. Next slide. Air emissions, they're looking at, there's a proposed rule to designate PFAS compounds as hazardous air pollutants, which will give them authority to regulate those emissions under the Clean Air Act. Next slide. The next two are the big ones that are really the sea change. First is there's currently a 70 part per trillion drinking water advisory guidance standard by US EPA, and US EPA is moving forward slowly because the process just from to adopt this rule at MCL does move slowly, but they are moving forward with adopting a final MCL for PFOA and PFOS, which they anticipate completing in the fall of 2023. Next slide. And the other sea change federal regulation that is forthcoming is the designation of PFOA and PFAS and potentially other compounds, PFAS compounds, as hazardous substances under CERCLA. So why is that could be the game changer? Because you could see all of these cleanup actions that are being filed, whether in the AFFF class action litigation or state cases. Once these become hazardous substances designated under CERCLA, there's going to be clear legal authority for people to pursue cleanup actions for PFAS contamination. And it's probably not much of a leap to say that many of those actions that currently are focused on common law theories could be converted to CERCLA actions. Next slide. So key takeaways were the states initially took the lead, but now the federal government is intent on moving forward with regulation. Although that still won't happen until likely 2023 when the new drinking water standard and likely the hazardous substance designation occurs. So those two things are really going to change the whole playing field in terms of the litigation, particularly on the cleanup side, but also on exposure with the drinking water standards. Next slide. Finally, I'm going to conclude with a brief overview on transactional issues. Next slide. Currently, right now, PFAS is not a hazardous substance. So for phase 1 assessments, if you're doing a transaction, purchasing real estate, doing a merger and acquisition, a business transaction, and you're doing phase 1s, the old phase 1 standard it focuses on hazardous substances that are designated, those compounds that are designated as hazardous substances, which PFAS is not. The brand new standard that just came out in November 2021 shifts that slightly to listing it as a non-scope optional issue that you should consider during your due diligence stage. So it's not mandatory as a phase 1, but it is something that businesses should consider as part of their transactions. Next slide. So the question is, how do you evaluate a compound that in some states is regulated with MCLs, other states have no MCLs, is not designated at the federal level as a hazardous substance? It makes it complicated. I mean, from a seller's perspective, and I've been on both sides of the tables with transactions negotiating these issues, most sellers take the perspective of, well, it's not a hazardous substance. It's not regulated in that particular state in many instances because only a handful of states have adopted MCLs. Therefore, and it's considered still a non-scope item under the most recent phase 1. So why are we even talking about this? It shouldn't be listed as a hazardous material or hazardous substance in the definitions within your contract, or it shouldn't be covered under the indemnity or release liability. Whereas buyers are saying, well, come on, the writing is on the wall. We're moving towards federal regulation. There's obviously class action litigation and major liability associated with PFAS. Therefore, those should be in those documents, at least until 2023, when these likely seem to be designated as hazardous substances. That tension is going to continue to exist. And you're going to go transaction by transaction, and this could be a major issue, particularly, next slide, particularly in industries that you would be classified as high risk, things that might have PFAS associated with them. And one I'll highlight is I had a transaction where the industry, the manufacturer, wasn't using PFAS in their system. But luckily, our consultant, I'll give a plug to TRC since Liz just spoke, flagged the issue that they may have used AFFF in their fire suppression system, and lo and behold, they did. Lo and behold, there was a release, and phase 2 did show pretty significant PFAS contamination. And luckily, we identified that issue during our due diligence, and it majorly complicated the transaction. So it is definitely an issue that you need to pay attention if you're doing transactions. And I think that's the last of my slides. Thank you much.
All right, we can transition over to Liz Hitchcock.
I think everything's on. Good afternoon, and thank you for including us in this event. I especially want to thank the folks at the Environmental Law Institute for organizing this and many other events. My name is Liz Hitchcock, and I direct Safer Chemicals, Healthy Families, which is a program of toxic-free future. We were founded in 2009 as, oh shoot. I apologize, I have to get to the right place in my notes. We were founded in 2009 as a campaign to bring together state coalitions that were pursuing policies on toxic chemicals in the states from Alaska to Maine, along with national environmental organizations that worked on toxic chemicals, with working too with labor, health, consumer, and business organizations to reform the nation's premier toxic chemical law, the Toxic Substances Control Act, with our goal of winning the greatest benefit for public health possible. And with passage of the Lautenberg Chemical Safety Act in 2016, we recognized that we had to keep working to ensure that the implementation of the law was solidly on the side of public health, and also work on public health threats from individual chemicals or classes of chemicals, and on one of the greatest chemical threats to our families and communities, which is the subject of today's seminar, PFAS chemicals. I will take a moment to apologize once again to the folks at ELI and to you all. My slides contributed to some of the technical difficulties today, so this will just give you the opportunity to picture some of the things I'm going to talk about. PFAS chemicals are chemicals that many of us couldn't even pronounce 10 years ago, and we weren't aware of how widespread they are in our lives and in the environment, and how many chemicals there actually are in the class. I'd like to talk today first about why the public is so concerned about PFAS, and I'll talk about the different ways that states, retailers, and the federal government are taking on the problem. And I'd like to put a particular emphasis on the focus we're putting on prevention of further pollution from these so-called forever chemicals. First up, why do we care? Many products are made with these compounds, including food packaging, such as fast food wrappers and takeout containers, and who hasn't had takeout over the last couple of years. Non-stick cookware, which was a miracle in doing the dishes in my family, but contains PFAS chemicals. Stain-resistant carpets, rugs, and furniture, and outdoor gear with water repellent coating, and aerospace, medical, automotive applications, and many specialty items such as firefighting foams that we've talked about before, ski wax, and industrial applications. So how is the public exposed to them? We are exposed to them through our food, air, and water, which have become contaminated globally as a result of manufacturing releases and use of PFAS-containing products. PFAS can build up in crops, fish, and livestock, ultimately contaminating the food we eat. In addition, when PFAS are used as food packaging or used in food packaging, such as in sandwich wrappers and takeout containers, they migrate to our food. They also, when the packaging is thrown away, they go into landfills or in some cases incinerators and continue to pollute the environment. In indoor air and dust, when PFAS are used in products to stain-proof our furniture and carpets or to waterproof our clothing, these items become PFAS factories, releasing the chemicals over time into air and into the dust in our homes. And in drinking water, the initial testing of some water systems in 2013 to 2015 revealed an estimated 6 million US residents with drinking water supplies contaminated with PFAS above safety levels set by the EPA. This number increases as more contamination is discovered almost weekly. And in 2018, ATSDR, the Federal Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry, say that 10 times fast, issued a draft report suggesting safety levels for PFAS 6 times lower than those used by EPA, meaning more communities may have PFAS levels in their water that are a concern for our health. In most areas, the source of pollution appears to be the use of firefighting foam and manufacture. Finally, in our homes and workplaces, PFAS are used in cleaners, in personal care products like waterproof mascara, and specialty products like ski wax, and this can lead to direct exposures from product use. We should be concerned about these because PFAS are extremely persistent in the environment, and some of them build up in people and migrate in people and animals. They migrate out of consumer products into household dust and air, are released by industries, and contaminate drinking water and food. Once they're in our bodies, they stick around with half-lives in people of up to 8 years. Exposure to these compounds has been linked to a number of health concerns, including cancers, hormone disruptions, liver and kidney toxicity, and harm to the immune system, and reproductive and developmental toxicity. Nearly every US resident, as Joe said, has PFAS in his or her body, and biomonitoring studies found PFAS in the blood, breast milk, umbilical cord blood, amniotic fluid, placenta, and other tissues. The testing that we commissioned at Toxic Free Future last year of 50 first-time mothers in the Seattle area found PFAS in all of the breast milk samples that we tested. So when we began to talk with offices in DC about PFAS chemicals 5 years or so ago, the first thing we talked about was turning off the tap on the chemicals and ending unnecessary uses of these chemicals. In fact, the first bill that we worked on was the 2018 reauthorization of the Federal Aviation Administration that had a short provision that allowed commercial or civilian airports to use non-PFAS firefighting foam by October 2021, I apologize. The bill passed with that provision, but it was clear that the problem of PFAS pollution isn't isolated to a couple of communities around airports and military bases or to Parkersburg, West Virginia, but that the PFAS problem is being felt in communities across the country, from Maine to Alaska to Florida and everywhere in between. So as my colleagues and I talked to folks on the Hill and at the federal agencies, we spoke in terms of 3 main buckets of work. 1, clean up the existing contamination. 2, identify sources of pollution and hold polluters accountable. And 3, prevent further contamination so we can stop digging the hole and stop making the problem worse. And what I'd like to spend the rest of my time talking about is the work that's being done to prevent further contamination. That action is happening in state governments, in the federal government, and at the corporate level. And our approach to tackling the problem of PFAS has to be as vast and diverse as the sources of our exposures. And with due respect to the many folks from inside the Beltway and at the federal agencies who are on this webinar, our federal system is not all that speedy and nimble to address these problems. So states and municipalities, which are up close and personal with the consequences of PFAS contamination, have stepped up to take action. And federal agencies are taking action to eliminate PFAS in some food packaging. The Department of Defense is phasing PFAS out of military meals ready to eat, or MREs, food packaging. States are taking action to eliminate PFAS in food packaging. And at the same time, grocery stores and restaurant chains have taken action to eliminate PFAS from some or all of the food packaging that's used in their outlets. I always like to say, from Whole Foods to McDonald's, companies have made commitments to get PFAS out of their food packaging. We're taking action on PFAS-based firefighting foam. The Department of Defense is phasing out the use of PFAS-based foam, and states have taken action through legislation and regulation to ban uses of firefighting foam containing PFAS, and to eliminate PFAS in carpets, rugs, and other textiles. States are also requiring disclosure of PFAS in firefighting personal clothing and equipment. And many retailers have taken action to restrict PFAS in the apparel, carpet, rugs, textile products, and other furniture that they sell. States like California and Maryland and major retailers like Target are taking action to eliminate or restrict certain PFAS chemicals in cosmetics. In 2021, we had another big year for action in the states to create incentives for safer chemistries and protections from these toxic chemicals. And I was happy to see Joe include the slide from Safer States, which identifies all of the progress that we've made in state regulation and legislation around PFAS chemicals. Last year, the states drove a big toxics agenda that included pushing for a class-based restriction on of toxic chemicals and transparency about what chemicals are in which products, identification of safer materials and processes were another area that the states worked on. In 14 states in 2021 adopted 32 policies. 4 states adopted state policy actions that set restrictions on PFAS chemicals and will have ripple effects across the country. For example, and I'll just do a couple of examples here, Vermont passed legislation in May that restricts the sale of consumer products containing PFAS and banned PFAS chemicals from firefighting foam, food packaging, ski wax, carpets, rugs, and stain-resistant aftermarket treatments. In Maine, they banned PFAS in all products by the year 2030, starting with carpets, rugs, and aftermarket treatment, and required manufacturers to report all uses of PFAS in products sold in Maine. And this is going to provide us with a valuable data set that will prompt further action across the country. They had other bills on PFAS that ranged from testing soil and groundwater to banning firefighting foams that contain PFAS. In California, they required truth in advertising for products that are labeled recyclable and banned PFAS and heavy metals in products that were labeled as such. They banned the entire class of PFAS chemicals from quote unquote juvenile products, from paper-based food packaging, and required the disclosure of PFAS in cookware. And in the middle, in Michigan, they were the first state to limit the state's procurement of products containing PFAS chemicals. And in addition to these precedent-setting policy wins, many other states this year took action to address the PFAS crisis, either by banning PFAS in food packaging, as they did in California, Connecticut, and Minnesota, by banning PFAS in firefighting foam, as in Connecticut, Illinois, and Vermont. And then there were states that had laws and regulations that they used to move forward on PFAS chemical policies. In California, they finalized regulations to address PFAS in carpets under their existing authority. New York banned restricted flame retardants. And in 2022, we're expecting the momentum to continue and more states to create incentives for safer materials and chemicals that will protect communities from PFAS chemicals and other toxic chemicals. Just last week, the Maryland Senate passed the George Walter Taylor Act, named for a veteran firefighter who died of cancer in 2020 at the age of 46. The bill will restrict the use of PFAS chemicals in food packaging and rugs and carpets and switch to safer alternatives for firefighting foams. The bill also requires notification for firefighter turnout gear that contains PFAS and stops the landfilling and incineration of PFAS foam. On the federal level, we're going to keep working to support federal action to end unnecessary uses of PFAS in consumer products. I mentioned that 7 states have banned the use of PFAS in food packaging, and it's time to protect consumers across the country by making that a national restriction. I want to stop here and thank you all. That's what my last slide said, and I look forward to hearing your questions.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Liz. We will now hand it over to Anita Desikin. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. I also want to thank the Environmental Law Institute and all the great speakers that have spoken here before. So I'm going to go ahead and get started with my presentation. Oh, sorry. Let me go back. Okay, so I'll be looking at PFAS through an environmental justice and science policy lens. And let me first start out by mentioning my organization. I work for the Union of Concerned Scientists as a senior analyst. The Union of Concerned Scientists have been doing science-based advocacy work for the last 50 years, and we advocate for a healthy planet and a safer world. So an overview, I'm going to talk about environmental justice, provide an introduction, talk about PFAS as an environmental justice issue, talk about PFAS at the federal level. So like Joseph, I'll be focusing on the PFAS roadmap from the EPA and provide some recommendations. So for environmental justice, I think it's important to go and think about the framework of what environmental justice is before we start. So this is a common one from academia. And so when you look at, for instance, race and ethnicity, right, there's a lot of research showing that people of certain race and ethnicities have a higher risk of getting certain types of health outcomes depending on the certain types of health outcomes depending on the factor. And the reason for this is not due to, or usually not due to something involving the individuals, it's usually due to a systemic process. So oftentimes with race and ethnicity, it's due to residential location. And this is coming back from horrifically racist policies from the 1930s called redlining that still affects our society today. So if you're in a disadvantaged community, you're going to get a series of stressors that'll cumulatively impact you and impact you on a certain stressful level that can cause harm. And so you see the same thing here with environmental hazards and pollutants. There'll be an exposure and a dose element that'll lead to a health effect. So the main takeaway here is that when you do see health disparities, it's due to longer systemic legacy, white supremacist legacy sort of elements, and it's not due to the people themselves. So to put it another way, Dr. Robert Bullard defines environmental justice like this. So all people are entitled to equal protection, environmental protection, but the situation is not equal and it has never been equal. And therefore, if you're a community that's located on the wrong side of the tracks, you're just going to get more air pollution or water pollution or whatever it is, which will lead to more health impacts. So we at the Union of Concerned Scientists have been thinking about reports on best ways for federal agencies to incorporate equity and environmental justice into their processes. And so here's kind of 2 takeaways. So science is underlining a lot of the ways we protect people from environmental hazards and occupational safety hazards and other types of things. And so therefore, when science is sidelined by policymakers, it's underserved communities that are going to bear the brunt of the harms. So it's imperative to implement strong science-based safeguards to address these disparities. So PFAS, so there's a lot that's been said about PFAS, and so I'll just give an overview here to state that, you know, when there's a lot of sources, as you can see, of where you can get exposed to PFAS. And so the more that it builds up in the body, the more likely you're going to get a health impact. So one of the questions that we had was, you know, as Liz Hitchcock has mentioned, it's communities across the US are getting faced by enormous levels of PFAS chemicals. But is there an environmental justice aspect of PFAS? Are certain communities disproportionately affected? So I'm going to show two UCS analyses that try to kind of think about that question. So one of them was looking at military bases and looking at the groundwater and drinking water associated, checking the PFAS levels in groundwater and drinking water near these sites. And what we found is when we compared it to the CDC's value that they consider a health risk, is that the vast majority of places were way overburdened with PFAS in their water. You can see most of the places here are marked red, which is an extreme level above 100 times the CDC's level. And we were seeing numbers that were going up to like 100,000 times these levels. So quite a large impact across the country. A second analysis we did, we partnered with Northeastern University and looking at civilian drinking water sites. And you can see here, there's some clustering in the map here, and this is more of an artifact of these states happen to be testing more. So this is not necessarily indicative of, you know, these states having more PFAS than say other states. It's more of an issue of more data availability because they're actually doing the testing. So our analysis was showing that, so basically we were trying to figure out, okay, you have these extremely contaminated sites, right? What are the community demographics around these sites? You know, who's living there, right? And we compared that to the US Census data. And what we found was that people who are living 5 miles from very contaminated sites are disproportionately more represented by low-income households, about 2% more than you expect based on the census. And for people of color, this is about 5% more. So the numbers 5%, 2%, they don't seem like a lot. So let's put this into real terms. So this would represent approximately 40,000 more low-income households than you'd expect based on the census data. And for people of color, this represents about 300,000 more. So according to this analysis, we're seeing PFAS being an environmental justice issue. So like many communities across the US are affected, but it appears to be disproportionately affecting low-income communities and communities of color. So in terms of the EPA, again, I'll focus in on the strategic roadmap that was released in October of last year, in which the EPA is trying for a whole of agency approach to address PFAS. And here's some of their guiding principles. So they want to consider the life cycle of PFAS. So, you know, coming in from the manufacturing, the distribution, the end of life cycle processes. They want to get upstream of the problem, which in this case means trying to make sure PFAS doesn't even get into the environment, doesn't get into people's bodies, you know, stopping the manufacturing of new PFAS chemicals along that line. Holding polluters accountable, ensuring science-based decision-making. And interestingly, one of the priorities here is actually environmental justice, which is a real positive here, you know. But at the same time, one of the areas of concern for environmental justice policies in general is that the way it's implemented means a lot, right? Certain ways of implementing can be super protective, and other ways can be super non-protective. So the details matter on this roadmap. And like Joseph, I'm going to describe the two major regulatory processes this roadmap is talking about. So one of them is related to CERCLA, so that's the Superfund law. And there's an upcoming rulemaking that'll designate the two most well-studied PFAS chemicals as a hazardous substance under CERCLA. And so this can be really great in terms of, you know, when the sites are designated as a Superfund area, this requires certain cleanup efforts. And one of the proportions of enforcement for this cleanup would be that third parties who cause the problem basically have to pay for the cleanup. And so instead of communities themselves needing to pay for testing, let's say, and other factors like that. Another thing that's pretty similar here is related to the Safe Water Drinking Act. So there's going to be enforceable drinking water limits, again, on the two most well-studied PFAS chemicals. And so we don't know what the EPA is thinking on their maximum containment limits. We hope it's as stringent and health protective as possible. But the main takeaways here is that we wish that they were doing more PFAS chemicals included in these regulatory processes, but this is a good start. And this is one of the few times we're seeing the federal government actually put in something with teeth, I'll say it that way. So put in something where there is actually regulatory processes and not processes of, you know, let's envision a better world, more like we will envision a better world and we'll have enforcement actions to denote that. So I think it's interesting. Let's see. Oh, okay. Sorry, my slides weren't advancing for a moment. So I think it's interesting to look at a case study of one of these actions that are coming up. And so this one is on the Toxics Release Inventory, which is a pretty prominent EPA database to look at what industries are emitting that could be harmful to health. And so the National Defense Authorization Act has authorized the EPA to put on certain chemicals as part of this reporting processes. So here's what the EPA is saying, though, in a recent announcement. Facilities were reporting that they had 800,000 pounds of these PFAS chemicals in 2020, but they only released 9,000 pounds. Now, the differences between those two numbers are enormous, and it's indicating that the industry is actually taking using exemptions and exclusions in the law or in the rule to make sure that they're hiding the data, that they're not reporting what is actually being admitted. So the EPA has an upcoming rule processes to try to close some of these loopholes, but you know, you could see this could go wrong really quickly if they don't fully consider all the ramifications here. So we want to, there's a lot at stake here, so we want the EPA to continue with this robust decision-making processes. And finally, some recommendations and things that we're watching for the EPA. One of them is that we believe that there should be a plan to regulate PFAS as a class of chemicals, and this should be guided by the EPA's Office of Research and Development. This current processes of a case-by-case basis is absurd, and it just means that we have communities are just going to continue to suffer the health consequences. Create more opportunities for meaningful input from impacted communities. One of the things we believe really strongly is that the lived experience of community members matter, and it should be incorporated into agency rulemaking, scientific processes, policy making. There needs to be good input, and this is actually an area that can get lacking pretty quickly, and so there needs to be some really concentrated efforts here. So the EPA's integrated risk information systems, this is almost a gold standard of how to do really good human health toxicology assessments. And so right now they're looking at a few PFAS chemicals. So we're eager to see those results. And one of the interesting things under the IRIS program here is that they're actually going to be looking at exposure to PFAS as it contributes to cumulative impacts in communities. Now, cumulative impacts is been an ask by environmental justice advocates for decades because overburdened communities are not facing just one pollutant, right? They're facing hundreds of them and other environmental stressors. And so having a picture of the cumulative impacts is going to be super important here. And it's great to see them thinking about this in this PFAS work. And finally, one of the areas that we were disappointed by in the roadmap was the EPA not talking about two areas that can affect disadvantaged communities. So this idea of PFAS containing sludge in farm fields. Now, some of this is a little bit under the Department of Agriculture's purview as well, but the EPA could have a voice here, and the fact that they didn't talk about it all in their roadmap is disappointing. And finally, the disposal of PFAS through incineration. You do see facilities that will like drive PFAS to a certain site where there's incineration, and those incineration sites tend to be in overburdened communities, marginalized communities. So these are big gaps in the EPA's roadmap. And so that's the end of my presentation. If you want to get connected with the Union of Concerned Scientists, please reach out and join our science network. And thank you. That's all.
Thank you, Anita. believe we do have time for some questions, and some questions that have been offered have been very specific. So we'll be sure that we come back to those with written responses after this presentation today. But one question that came up is how reputable are AFFF manufacturer claims that post 2015, 2016 produced foams do not contain PFAS?
I mean, I can attempt to maybe answer the question. So, I mean, we know PFOS was phased out. Well, began to be phased out in 2002. So, I can't say that, you know, I know for a fact that all AFFF manufactured in 2015, 2016 does not contain PFOS, but I would highly doubt it. And I know some states have actually done studies. I think New York's doing a pretty big study on the different AFFF manufacturers, so that might be a good source to get a better idea. But I would feel like it's probably true that they do not contain PFOS.
Okay. And Liz, probably another question to you is, what is the preferred method of lab prep for sample analysis?
Okay, I think you're probably referring to what I talked about with the aqueous samples with particulates. So I think it's really going to depend on your project objective. So, you know, like surface water and wastewater, you would want to consider making sure that you analyze the particulates and the aqueous sample, like for a total measurement, if it's for remedial treatment design, compliance, permitting, or risk assessment. And the idea, what we really want the lab to do is to analyze the aqueous portion, to extract the aqueous portion, and also extract that particulate portion, and then combine them, the extracts together, to do one analysis of the whole sample. So you get a total measurement of what's in that sample. Now, there may be times when you don't need total. Again, it will depend on your objective, but you should always know what you're looking at when you do look at aqueous data that may have had particulates in it. Know how the lab handled it, because again, it can really affect your results. So the lab, I just want to say the lab, either sometimes they centrifuge the samples to separate out the particulates. Some of them just maybe decant it off. It's very varied. It varies from lab to lab. So.
This next question, it's two parts. I'll ask the first to the panel. How concerned should we be about the lack of oversight in synthetic turf fields? They all contain PFAS and are spreading all across America, replacing natural grass. Does anybody want to jump in and
I can just say I've been hearing about it more and more lately, especially here in the Northeast, where communities are concerned. I don't know if the concerns are, you know, necessarily valid or not. And I can tell you that we are involved in a pretty in-depth synthetic turf project right now, where we're going to really look in detail at the different components of the synthetic turf, breaking it down from the infill, the carpet, and the pad. And we're going to be doing analysis for about 70 different PFAS. We're going to be doing that top assay analysis I talk about to see if there's any of those precursor compounds that can break down. And we're also going to be doing what's called a QTOF analysis, which really goes in and looks at unidentified peaks and what they are. So, I mean, I suspect we're going to see some PFAS, but whether or not these PFAS are present at significant levels or levels that pose a risk is a whole other question. I mean, PFAS are everywhere, unfortunately. So it's just going to be a matter of determining what's acceptable and what's not. That's my take on it anyway.
Yeah. And Joe, are you still on the line and able to take a follow-up question?
Sure, I'm here.
Okay. Yeah, great. Thank you. We are told that there is no oversight in Illinois. How can we bring awareness? Is there a class action coming on synthetic fields with PFAS?
Wow, that's a tough question to answer. I think first of all, I would back up that if you're talking, it sounds like that question is more directed towards personal injury type claims. So you're going to be looking at, you know, a lot of states, including Ohio, that does not have standards for PFAS, similar to Illinois. Obviously, one of the largest class action suits was brought here in Ohio, two of them, So it doesn't preclude an action from being filed in Illinois. I don't have specific, certainly from a legal perspective, I don't have any insights into the turf issue other than what Liz just alluded to, that I think, PFAS is everywhere. Just because it is in certain products doesn't necessarily mean there's a release or exposure. Obviously, there's going to be more studies, and Liz just talked about what she's doing to that degree. So again, just because it's present doesn't mean there's an exposure, is the only other thing I would add.
Joe, there are a couple more questions that have come in for you, and I think we have time to get to both of them. Are you aware of any litigation that was filed that did not get referred to either MDLs?
Wow. That
Very
yes.
broad, I realize.
Yes, that's an extremely
we can
broad
certainly
question.
follow up with some broader
Yes,
response.
I am aware that there has been state action claims that were not consolidated into the MDL. So, and here, let me just, from a broad perspective, give you example. You don't have to, if it doesn't involve AFFF, it's not going to be in the MDL for AFFF, right? So that's one. And then Hardwick is really a personal injury, medical monitoring at this stage claim. So what you don't capture in there is other uses of PFAS that, local municipality may say they got exposed through some other source of PFAS than AFFF. There are other things that aren't going to fit into those MDLs that could be state-specific actions.
I guess the second part of that is, are you aware of any active litigation against the DoD for AFFF contamination from military facilities?
Yeah, I saw that question come up in the comments. Nothing is coming to mind. I will highlight a couple of things on that. First of all, to sue the federal government, there's some legal hurdles you got to clear. First of all, depending on the claim, but you're likely going to have to bring a Federal Tort Claims Act claim. There's also sovereign immunity issues for the federal government because there's what's called the discretionary function immunity provision, which basically means if the federal government was doing something within their duties, there's an immunity provision that can be a pretty high hurdle to cross in bringing claims against the federal government. In the MDL, I think the plaintiffs have been public about it. I mean, I've read press articles about this, that, there's some strategy too in terms of from the plaintiff's perspective. Again, I'm just commenting from articles I've read, not any insights from the AFFF litigation I'm involved in. But the comments I've read is that bringing in the federal government can complicate claims against manufacturers, because you want to be, from a plaintiff perspective, you want to be able to say, hey, the manufacturers hid this from everyone, including the federal government, and it's cleaner. Again, their comments, not mine. To bring a suit against the manufacturers from that perspective.
Well, I think we will end it there. We do have a record of all the questions submitted, and we'll work on getting responses to those out for the attendees. I want to thank you again for participating in today's webinar regarding PFAS. Thank you to the panelists and to ELI for organizing this event. Have a good evening.